Welcome to the Norwegian Anthropological Association's celebration of the European Anthropology Days and World Anthropology Day. My name is Christine Jacobsen, and I'm a professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen and a chair of the board of the Norwegian Anthropological Association. We mark this day with a deep sense of both loss and apprehension for the future. Just before Christmas, we lost one of Norway's most influential academic voices, Thomas Hylland Eriksen. Known for challenging established truths and addressing politically controversial topics such as migration, multiculturalism, and climate change, his absence is deeply felt. Acknowledging that the challenges and dilemmas related to public engagement for anthropologists are today more pressing than ever, we have called this digital panel discussion Engaged Anthropology in Turbulent Times. Several of our European and American colleagues have recently faced sanctions due to their engagement against the war in Gaza. Established research fields in anthropology, such as notably migration and gender, have been criticized for being ideological and politicized. Simultaneously, our interlocutors are calling for a more reflexive and responsible research practice. With me for today's panel discussion, I have three anthropologists who are all based in Norway, but whose education, academic experience, and scholarly impact are international in scope. Heath Cabot is Associate Professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Bergen and head of the Association of Political and Legal Anthropology in the American Anthropology Association. The topics of her research span refugees and asylum issues in Europe, human and social rights, and access to healthcare. Heidi Mogstad is a senior researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute and editor of Norsk Anthropologisk Tidsskrift, the Norwegian Anthropological Journal. Her research interests include migration, humanitarianism, and war, among other things. And last but not least, Katrine Thorleifsson is Associate Professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo and has been the head of the Norwegian government's Commission on Extremism. She has done research on, among other things, the far right, radicalization, and nationalism. We will be approaching a series of large and challenging questions in the next hour or so, but I wanted to start with the notion of engaged anthropology. Engaged anthropology has been used in the last couple of decades to refer to various forms of sharing of knowledge outside of academia, partly overlapping with such terms as public and applied anthropology. Louise Lamphra identified three different areas of engaged anthropology, and she talks about, firstly, about collaboration and partnership with the people we study. Secondly, she talks about outreach in the form of research dissemination in the public. And thirdly, she speaks about policy initiatives or efforts to influence policies in areas of expertise. So before we address the challenges that engaged anthropology are currently facing, and possible ways to meet these challenges individually and collectively, I wanted to invite the panel to speak to how they understand and how they practice engaged anthropology. So maybe we can start with you, Katrine. You were awarded the Research Council of Norway's Dissemination Prize for 2024 for fearless dissemination and dialogue.
Thank you very much, Christina. No, I think we all, as anthropologists, social scientists, do have an obligation to disseminate our research to a wider audience. And in my research, I have a long experience both disseminating to policy and decision makers. As you said, I recently led a government commission providing advice on how to better prevent violent extremism, and it's based on research, so to engage both with policy and decision makers, and on the other hand also engage with the larger public at large. And I think if we contribute to the public square, we can help shape dialogue about what things are important and what to do about them. And if we just stay here in the office in the ivory tower, we have lots of great ideas and peer-reviewed articles. But as we know, it takes time for those ideas to reach the audience. And for me, I studied the rise of authoritarian governance, which is a pressing issue of our time. So I think it's vital that we do have these conversations in the public square, and that we also spend time disseminating new ideas and also ideas that can help safeguard lives and create better futures.
Thank you, Katrine. Heidi, you frequently participate in public debates both in Norway and internationally on Norwegian and European asylum and migration policies and more. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your engaged anthropology?
Sure. I can start by saying that I very much agree with what Katrine said. I think being a researcher is a great privilege, and you can go to work almost every day and write and read and learn something. And yeah, the least you can do is to share with the public what you have found. For me, the public anthropology was something that I think I've become. I mean, I did my bachelor at the University of Oslo, so already I was trained into that tradition. But I think I become especially aware of the importance when I did my master studies at the University of Cape Town, where I collaborated with a few of the local social justice organizations there. And what was really special and great, I think, about the University of Cape Town was that they had really I would say strict, but appropriate as well, ethical guidelines. So it wasn't really enough to, just make sure you didn't do any harm. You should also practice proper reciprocity and make sure that you give back to the communities you worked with. So being a student there kind of installed that value into my work, which I try to carry with me in my later career as a student and now a scholar. So I think I'm most experienced with collaborating with organizations, both with the South African organization and then later with Norwegian humanitarian organization, both volunteer-based, but also, for example, Norwegian People Aid. I've been talking for NOAS, the Red Cross, and so on. But I also done, as you said, quite a lot of public dissemination writing for newspapers and magazines, think tanks, and so on. What I have least experience with is the important work that Katrine and others have done, working more policy oriented. But I was part of a commission work investigating it was a real-time evaluation of the Nansen support to Ukraine. And that for me was also very valuable experience, and something, since I'm working as a research institute, something that I'm likely, hopefully, to do more of in the future.
Heath, you also have quite a bit of experience in collaboration, and I know that you've during your field works, you've also been a volunteer in solidarity networks in Greece where you've been working. Could you tell us a bit more about your own engagement as an anthropologist?
Sure, thank you. I guess I wanted to, well, in preparation for our conversation today, I went back to Thomas Hillend Eriksson's book about engaging anthropology, and I just wanted to mark, maybe we can talk about it or think about it a little today. He talks about how Norway is kind of an exception in the sense that there are anthropologists, has been a long tradition of anthropologists in the public sphere, whatever that is, and that there are a lot of challenges, and I think real challenges that have kept, certainly in the U.S., where I've been based until just 2 years ago, that have kind of kept anthropologists out of the public. That's changing a bit with Jason DeLeon winning the National Book Prize for his book on smuggling. But I guess I just wanted to say that when we get to the next, I know we're going to talk about challenges, and public dissemination is something that I think a lot of us would like to be able to do more of, but that we've struggled to do. So I guess I wanted to add, I take a little bit, a little bit of a flexible idea of engagement that I pull from Catherine Besteman, actually, who talks about, she has a wonderful piece called 3 Reflections on Public Anthropology. And she really distinguishes engagement and public. Of course, we don't have to worry too much about the nitpicky differences. But for her, engagement is really about those collaborative relations, right? But also a collaborative orientation to relationships in the field, whatever that is, as well as a focus on transformation of some kind for the better, right? And of course, that means taking a moral judgment and intervening and recognizing oneself as a moral actor. And so for me, those spaces of collaboration and engage and moving towards transformation have indeed been organizations of different kinds, and sometimes organizations. I think Heidi probably both of you, all of us can think about this. These are not ethically pure spaces, right? You know, these are complicated venues. So being willing to engage in conversation and critique with people, and accept also critique from others during fieldwork. I try to engage with different publics, for instance, government organizations or government institutions, government actors as well, mostly in conversation. But I also think that the classroom has been probably one of the most important sites for me, having taught intercultural anthropology, many times to 300, 200, 300 students in Trump's US. That was a really important space to engage people and sort of try to get students to look beyond certain, certain norms, ideas that they had. And so I think I just want to add the classroom is a really important public, right? It's a public venue of a kind. I think it's a little different from research and the ivory tower. And I'm hoping maybe we can also think about teaching as a kind of engagement as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heath. I mean, you already touched on some of the challenges that you are facing as an engaged anthropologist. So I wanted to invite the panel to reflect a bit further on these challenges. Some of them we did mention in the description of this seminar on how engaging with various publics, anthropologists across Europe and the US are navigating such things as notably the rise of populist and authoritarian politics, the concentration of global media power among wealthy elites, and now also the impact of artificial intelligence, etc., on knowledge production. So we already mentioned some of these, but I imagine also that these challenges will be both partly context specific, so relating to the particular locales that you work in, that some of them are also more global or transnational, and that of course they're also related to the kind of engagement that we're talking about. So whether it is challenges related to public dissemination or challenges related to collaboration or to trying to influence policies. So Katrine, would you like to start to speak to the challenges that you see anthropology facing in these times?
Yes, I mean, for those of us who are contributing to public knowledge as engaged anthropologists, we have a tremendous responsibility. Both the concepts and the terminology we use will help shape public both opinion and also perception of the topics under scrutiny. So for instance, I have been working on the rise of the far right the past 20 years, and the past few years we've seen a rapid normalization of those ideas. And then if I refer to how my informants describe themselves, it would be as national patriots. But I refer to them, some of them as, right-wing extremists. I use other terminologies. And it's important that I also stay consistent with that, even though we see that some of these actors are actually moving from the margins to the center of power these days. So I think it's really about, in my particular field, it's both a normative judgment and it's an intervention. It's more actually moral, perhaps, and it poses lots of ethical dilemmas in translating, giving voice versus actually translating in the concepts we use, how they will also inevitably shape a public perception of rapid political change. And I think also going back to the policy work, because I think we can work with anthropological methods as we did in the Commission on Extremism. We had lots of mini fieldworks. We did interviews with interlocutors, working with survivors bereaved of terrorist attacks, working with actors from both private and public sector, from government, municipalities, law enforcement, educators, so a range of various sectors represented. And of course, we use different language. So again, the particularizing discourses of anthropology are inevitably a bit lost in terms of the pragmatics of language and terminology in having more universal language, like the topic of extremism, which can be heavily criticized from an anthropological point of view. What is extremism? It's context dependent and it's historically informed. But at the same time, when you look at the pragmatics of having policy solution, you need to also use terminology that might not everyone will agree upon, but that still can also lead to change and resolve.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, that challenge of developing a critical vocabulary, or of being part of shaping the discourse about certain phenomenon in the public, is something that has been addressed and that has been debated a lot also in the field of migration research that both Heidi and Heath have been working with. Heidi, would you like to address that and maybe also other challenges that you see for engaged anthropology today?
Yeah, I was actually thinking the same parallel to migration while you were speaking, Catherine, and about how kind of what used to be seen as right-wing extremism has now become, part of the mainstream. And very often I hear people, saying that it's so healthy that we suddenly are, tackling the woke culture and using this kind of vocabulary and presenting that as a good thing. And part of what I've been concerned about in my work has been to kind of challenging the ideas of what is possible and acceptable within the migration discourse, because I sometimes feel that some researchers, not necessarily anthropologists, they also kind of police this boundary of what is seen as possible, and positioning themselves as sort of like the moderate voice between like the crazy, naive, utopian activist and like the right-wing extremist, and then they are like the voice of reason, positioning themselves some place in between. But that between is, that middle is actually quite conservative and nativist. So I think that's again going back to developing a critical vocabulary that can challenge, state discourses and state categories, and not necessarily, thinking like the state, or viewing, for example, migration from the perspective of the North. So I think since the framing of this discussion is the loss of Thomas Hylland Eriksen, he's a really, really brilliant example of somebody who always did that. And he also had the particular skill of saying things in a quite simple way that I think resonated with people. And one comment I remember he said I can't remember if it was on a public seminar on TV, but many years ago, he said something about how he like felt more in common with the moderate Muslim, and I'm sure you can criticize that terminology, but that's what he said, than with like a conservative Christian on the west coast of Norway. And it's a bit provocative, but still it's something that kind of challenged this idea of the nation as being what we necessarily have to identify with, and likeness and belonging and so on. So so I think that's super, super important. I think in terms of other challenges, Katrina just briefly touched upon as well, but this rise of kind of authoritarianism and populism, which we see across the world, which goes hand in hand, I think, with also with the devaluation of research and scientific expertise. I think here in Norway, we've been a bit lucky so far, and that's something I really notice after relocating back to Norway, that the Norwegian government still looks out for input from anthropologists and other scholars a lot, which is something we can't take for granted and which we should value. I mean, also in everything from aid to energy, like they really look for, they call it like the fact should control policy. Fakta. Hamakta. But I just think it's very important that we don't take that for granted, because speaking to colleagues elsewhere, that's definitely not the case. And then I have to mention the targeted attacks on academic freedom, especially in response to scholarship on Palestine and Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices speaking out against the genocide. And also after the 7th October attack, really harsh attacks on historization and comparison and contextualization, which I think many anthropologists were way too silent about. We don't need to be, expert on Palestine or regional expert to speak out about these things, which very much concern the trade, our trade. And the final thing that I want to add that really emerged from the conversation that I've been part of the last few years is that seems to be a strong link between this repression and silencing of scholarship, and especially nowadays scholarship about Palestine or and academic precarity. So those things I think is important to see interlinked, because it's the kind of the again, not as much in Norway than elsewhere, but I think we also see this in Norway, is the normalization of precarity kind of allows this repressive academic environment to take place and continue. And if it doesn't lead automatically to repression, it leads to self-censorship, because people are afraid of speaking out, because it can threaten their careers and job security, and not even can, it has. There's so many examples of people already in Europe losing their jobs, job contracts withdrawn, and so on. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Heidi, at least for bringing in this dimension, or the structural aspects of academia itself, and how that is also part of the challenges that we are currently facing, such as the precarization of academic labor. Heath, how do the challenges of engaged anthropology look from your position?
Thank you. So, I think I'm in a little bit of a, well, literally a liminal position, having sort of recently started in Norway, but it'll be a while before I have a real sense of the discourses and the challenges here. And also watching the US, my home country, completely go off the rails on so many of my colleagues. I mean, just today, I just received a message from my former university, where I'm still, University of Pittsburgh, where I'm still affiliated, saying that the National Institute for Health, they're going to cut down the amount of money that grants or major national funding agencies give to institutions, down to just 15% from 50%, which is enormous. I mean, if you think about the implications of how this is, if it goes forward, is going to affect research. So, I'm really thinking, like, I'm trying to update my knowledge and thinking that we're not just talking about, the devaluation of expertise and knowledge, right? We're also talking about literally like the dismantling. And, I know that there are similar, much less aggressive measures happening also here in Norway, right? So I think, that's also just something to think about. And the fact that academics are the people who are sorry, this is a little bit of a digression, but I think this is the reality that we're facing, that, we're a lot of academics are going to be deeply affected, which is going to affect the world in other ways. and yet who's going to be able to make the decisions that actually impact people? So, people being willing to take positions of leadership, people who are competent leaders, I think that's going to be really important. Because oftentimes we're not always the best at leading, dealing with institutions, money, that kind of thing, politics. So that's just, I think I just wanted to say that. And I think the more general issue that I've encountered in terms of I'm just going to say the relevance of anthropology in particular has been a sort of a tendency to conflate urgency with meaning or relevance. So, and this is complicated because emergent situations oftentimes really demand a quick response, right? And it's great to be able to produce one or intervene in a way that's meaningful in an emergent situation. At the same time, like, that's a very dangerous moment because sometimes we need time, right? You were saying you've been working for 20 years, right? I would love to talk to you about things because I know you've been there. I know you've been doing that work. At the same time, very often the people who, like, for instance, migration research, I'll never forget, I was asked to do a lecture to a group of concerned citizens, and I did research in Greece a number of years before the refugee crisis, which was now 10 years ago. And I was trying to talk about more general kinds of comments about borders and securitization, and people just wanted to know, like, what's going on in the Aegean border now, and I hadn't been to the Aegean border now, so I think very often people want to sort of mistake the role of the anthropologist as being able to speak to what's on the ground right now. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, we're kind of an uncomfortable, our discipline is not very good at sort of we're a history of the recent present, like everything, right? But we're not very good at claiming either like historical legitimacy for our work or that sort of the moment like legitimacy that, for instance, certain forms of German journalism do, right? And also there is this tension between like the need to speak into things in a quick way while also spending time to gather the context, right? And to know the situation. And I don't have really an answer for how to deal with that, but I think it's been certainly a defining issue in my own work on migration. I've written about this, and I wrote a book about Greece and borders, and then I think largely because I was at an unknown institution and I was an early career scholar, it was really hard for me to get anybody to talk to me about it. I remember I was like sending emails to public radio in the US, say, hey, I'd be glad to talk, and here are some pieces I wrote, and maybe I just did a really bad job of it, I certainly listen to a lot of very uninformed people on the radio, and so sometimes I don't really, that's something that I certainly didn't succeed at. And so I'm really excited when I see a piece that Heidi recently published, right, in something like the Conversation, am I right? You've written for a bunch of different things, and I'm so impressed with that, and the fact that clearly there's mentoring, as well as some people can write in ways I think that speak really well to those larger publics. So in any case, I don't have any answers. These are just some of the many challenges that I think are emerging or have emerged already.
Yeah, and thank you, He, for pointing out not least this relationship between the sort of the acceleration of public debate and the belatedness of anthropology, in a sense that anthropological knowledge is something that takes time, right? It's not always something, as you say, that is most on the up-to-date facts happening right now. So that's one thing. And we also started talking a little bit here about sort of the comparative context and the lessons that we can learn from comparing different contexts here of engaged anthropology. And we already mentioned that since the 1960s already, anthropologists in Norway have been engaged in public discussions about such things as Sami rights, indigenous rights, immigration and integration, international development policies, gender equality, et cetera, et cetera. And in their edited volume on engaged anthropology, views from Scandinavia, Synnøve Bendiksen and Tone Bringe, they argued that outreach and policy-related activities have a stronger position in Scandinavian anthropology than collaborative and activist research, which they argued had sort of been comparatively stronger in the US. So I was thinking that's maybe an interesting point to start reflecting a little bit more comparatively on the challenges that we're all facing now. Do we still in Norway see this sort of closeness to policy in certain areas? Katrine, for instance, you who worked on the Extremism Commission, maybe you could speak to that.
Yes, as Heidi also said, I do think in Norway is a bit of maybe the exception compared to the US context, because we do have various governments from across the political spectrum that do appreciate evidence-based policy. And we have a long tradition of these public Norwegian reports being issued of committees or commissions that consist of very often researchers and very often are headed by researchers. And I think that's a privileged position to have, particularly when we see the rising now contempt for knowledge and how central that is in the dismantling of democracy. And we know that also critical thinking and critical and constructive disagreement is really so central to a thriving democracy as well. So I think we still have, perhaps more than confidence as well as anthropologists in the Nordic region, and in Norway in particular, because we are listened to, and you actually have valuable insight that might also impact policy. And I think, of course, the same dilemmas as described elsewhere, we belong to a discipline with premised on slow thinking, the slow publication cycle, decades of in-depth knowledge, and yet we also have confidence to comment on the news cycle, what happens, but doing that in a more ethical manner. So it's not just, for me, instance, like commenting a far-right uprising in a European country. It would be then, what kind of concepts do I use? When do I refrain from contributing? I say, and my job is to say a lot of no as well, is to police those borders of what I consider responsible dissemination and what I think is just for the clickbaits, for instance. So it's constantly making informed ethical judgments also on a very changing media landscape. But I can give you one case of how I think we managed to influence media coverage for the better in Norway, for instance. So, sorry, it's my, a part of the commission, we invited editors from large news outlets in Norway to the island of Utøya, where the atrocious 22nd of July attack took place in 2011, 22nd of July 2011. So it's a landscape of trauma, it's a landscape of traumatic loss, where 69 people were killed. And then we had a conversation about how do we cover domestic terrorism, and several also of these terrorist attacks that are occurring in the US, or even the storming of Congress, which is in turn is inspired by digital subcultures and inspired by this global co-authoring located in multiple countries and countries, and also an ongoing flow of exchange of ideas between the US and Norway. So there's really a transatlantic strong idea, also with input from South Africa, from New Zealand, Australia, and other countries. And then one thing is, training and education is that we also, as researchers, and particularly on those of us who are researching digital lives or the exploitation of new and emerging technologies, can also educate the big media companies and the tech companies about how to create a more ethical coverage, because we know that it's going to be covered anyways. So it's just an example of, I think, positive change for the better. So we see now no images of perpetrators, highlight the victims, highlight the bereaved, and do not reproduce internet culture that can have inspiring effects, for instance. So just a case study for how that can be done.
But Katrine, do you think that that's something that we could try also in other areas? Because my experience is that it's very hard, and I remember Thomas Hylland Nielsen also wrote about this, and in this book that I just mentioned, Engaged Anthropology, A View from Scandinavia, where he wrote about sort of that was getting more and more difficult actually to. I don't know how I don't remember exactly how he frames it, but it was getting more and more difficult to have to get other sort of framings into the debate when he was speaking. And here he uses as an example, when he speaks about migration and multiculturalism, there seems to be much less room for play, for raising questions, for bringing out complexity. He says when he wrote this piece in 2015, as compared to when he were talking publicly about these issues in the 1990s. So I'm thinking, do you think this is sort of transferable to other areas, the experience you had around influencing sort of the media frames of extremism?
I do, if you engage with stakeholders and gatekeepers. So it's it's about also introducing nuanced complexities about responsibility. And I think in the migration field is to highlight the human consequences of securitization policies, for instance. Highlight. I just had colleagues that warned about the human consequences of policies implemented by the new administration under Trump, instead of just writing about this as a normal phenomenon, but to actually retain focus on the human consequences. And I think, no, you will not always gain impact. You will not always gain impact, but at least there's an attempt, because the other option would be to say, I kind of stay in my office, I write my articles, and then someone else will talk to policymakers. It's perhaps that's easier, and then you will publish your article in 2 years on how democracies are dying and being dismantled. But in the meanwhile, you have actually human lives that are being shattered along the way. So I think it's working across these temporalities as both committed to advancing the discipline and the rigorous ideas and deep thinking, while also having a moral obligation and be to the responsiveness of the consequences of whether it's new migration policies, whether it's new border regimes, or whether it's de facto racist policies that are having human consequences.
Thank you. Heidi, you already started also addressing this comparative dimension by bringing up sort of the what has been called an exceptionalism of Norwegian engaged anthropology. But do you see this as a sort of, is it still there, or is it also changing with sort of the broader challenges that we have been talking about now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Catherine is better positioned to answer than me, since it's not so many years ago since I returned to Norway. But I think at least compared to I mean, it depends what you compare to. I think compared to South Africa, I'm not sure if we are so exceptional or not necessarily a better place for public anthropology. But I do think there are definitely things that's working really well in Norway, which I mentioned earlier, that we can't take for granted. And one for sure is this recognition of evidence-based knowledge, which at least in my experience, both engaging with governance bureaucrats and policymakers are very, eager to learn. Many of them read the scientific studies themselves, challenge also the assumption that we come in with, and sometimes also I think feel that at least some of what I'm saying is a bit too utopian or too much belonging to the conversation of the ivory tower and too abstract maybe. But I think sometimes it's also very healthy to be called out on that, and then you can then discuss and try to make a better case for it, and maybe also change your framing a bit. But that's a constant negotiation, and I think with public anthropology you do have to sometimes make compromises. I think what's uncomfortable is that sometimes you don't really make always the compromises yourself, because if you write an op-ed, for example, and you write, I mean, it depends on the newspaper, but some newspaper in Norway have a lot more editorial control. So they change the headline, or they, you know, edit out some of the nuances that you thought were important. So I definitely have learned some lessons the hard way, in this sense, and, you know, insisting on reading through things like this. I think also it's been like a bit of a humbling experience sometimes, because in a way that's what we do with our ethnographic material when we, you know, conduct interviews and observation. I think I really remember from one of your article, Heath, you talk about how we domesticate people's stories, and I just remember that phrase because I think it's very true. And and now when we write for public audiences, and we give up some of our control of the story we want to tell to the newspaper editors, and that can sometimes be very uncomfortable. I think especially a few times that the article that was published at the end, you know, position kind of what I was saying, my interlocutor was saying as my normative view. So it is a few times like that. It's been a little bit unsettling, but I think, yeah, it's you have to make a little bit compromises and put yourself in a vulnerable position when you do engage with public anthropology. I don't know if yeah, I answered your question, but I do think that after especially after returning from UK, I have really appreciated kind of the Norwegian and like recognition of the value anthropologists do, and also I feel like well, I came from Cambridge. It's not it's not, you know, maybe representative for UK as a whole, but I feel that in Norway the public engagement is much more valued than at least the anthropology department in Cambridge when I was there. I think it has changed a bit, but I think it's really good feeling to be a place where it's not it's valued that you engage in these things, although it doesn't matter that much as much to the publication list or to the hiring process. It does value, or it is valued, and I think that's a good thing, and also something we should protect.
Mm. And I remember you saying that this is also something that you were considering, or that came up in relation to the work that you've been doing on speaking out against the war in Gaza and how scholars can engage in that. There is also a comparative dimension that maybe you could address, that how sort of being in Norwegian academia maybe gave you a sense that it was easier to engage from that point of view on this particular controversial topic that has been sort of extremely politicized, and where scholars, colleagues in anthropology have been sanctions in other countries.
Yeah, so I'm co-editing with Laurie Allen this issue on speaking out in response to genocide and academic repression. And because of that, I heard, and also because of my engagement in motions inside IASA and also inside the World Anthropological Congress, I heard so many stories of anthropologists being repressed and intimidated and silenced. And I really, it's a really bleak picture. In Norway, I think almost I wouldn't say the opposite, and definitely I know political activists in Norway who also think that there have been similar tendencies in Norway, but I think on a very different scale. And I think, to be honest, that some of the institutional statements that have been published at different universities and think tank and this are not more radical than the political discourse coming from the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So by the Norwegian Minister of Foreign Affairs being so vocal and recognizing Palestine as a state and so on, it's been, you know, creating a space for for scholars to speak out as well. Although I don't think that should be a precondition, but that's basically what happened. So for me, it was, for example, it was no good reason why I should be presenting the motion at the EASA conference in Barcelona. I'm not an expert on Palestine. I'm a junior scholar. I'm really nobody. A lot of people know who I am. But the reason why I did it together with Fiona Murphy was exactly because a lot of people who would have been a better choice were hesitant to do so because they're in a very precarious position. And I was actually surprised by how many that was the case for, all across Europe, basically, but except for Norway, Sweden, and Spain, and a few other countries. And I think just one thing I want to add to this discussion about speaking out in response to what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank and the Middle East, is that I feel like many anthropologists have been reluctant to speak out because they're not expert on Palestine or the region. And I really sympathize with that. And I really also agree with that in some ways. But I do think that sometimes it's a little too much of a tendency to think that we're expert on our region only and not kind of also recognize ourselves as having a thematic expertise. And sometimes also, like, it's not like I can speak to everything happening in Norway, although I've, done a lot of research. Most of my research has been on Norwegian issues. So sometimes I feel like that's also a bit problematic that we think that in terms of the category of the nation state, that's kind of like, I'm an Africanist and so on. Like, you're not really an Africanist. Like, you know a little bit about, certain issues and communities there. So it's kind of like balancing this, recognizing that we can mobilize some of our thematic expertise and speak out, and balancing that with the recognition of, which both Heath and Catherine touched upon, about anthropology requiring slow research, knowledge of language and culture and so on. So, but I don't think we should kind of be silent just because we don't have worked in a region for 10 years. And so, and especially in terms of Palestine, I think also it's a strong case to be made that we should speak out as a scholarly community when what's happening in Palestine is partly a scholasticide, like a targeted attack on Palestinian system of education, educational infrastructure and knowledge systems, which make us implicit and also make us obligated to speak out as scholars. And yeah, I'll end there.
Thank you, Heidi. Heath, you've been based until recently in the US. And of course, what happens there is something that we're all following closely these days, with worry about what is going to happen to the possibility not only of engaged scholarship and participation in public debate, but the possibilities maybe of doing research and teaching in central anthropological topics, such as migration and gender, etc. So if we think comparatively, how does it look from your comparative experience so far between Norway and the US?
Oh, wow. So great question. And I don't know because I'm not teaching. It's funny, my partner teaches in the US, even though he's in Norway. He teaches online, and so I get a little bit. We have these conversations at home, but I just want to say I'm not teaching in this context right now, even if I am in conversation with people in the US. But it's interesting because I think certain categories. So of course, right now with Donald Trump's angry sort of banning of the whole concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, this is horrible. Like, and we're the study of human diversity, fundamentally, if that's what we think about anthropology, or at least one of the things that anthropology is about. I don't know what's going to happen to teaching around those issues. But up until now, I certainly have found concepts like, and I think this is well, I don't know. Concepts that used to be that used to be something I could sort of talk about in class, as things that students would say, yeah, that's a concept. We can talk about this. I think those don't necessarily translate. Well, I'm teaching in English still in Norway, but those, for instance, race, right? And I think there's a tendency, and I realize I'm going into an uncomfortable area right now, and an area that I'm a little uninformed about, perhaps. But sometimes I will talk about race, and I will try to make a case for thinking about white supremacy as a global formation. It's particularly talking about migration. I think it's really important to at least talk through those concepts. And I've had students come and say, "Can we talk about this? I really don't know about this concept." And I think students in the U.S. are very, very, even white students are very, very fluent, or have, particularly the Generation Z students, have been very fluent in the sort of the semiotics of race, the way it's talked about, right? Like, as it's some people who are white who are able to talk about whiteness, the importance of talking about race at all, right? Rather than just pretending it doesn't exist. Because the whole idea of being race blind has now been weaponized by the Trump administration, as if to talk about difference is to reinscribe oppression. So, I think this is something I don't know what to do with in Norway. I think that it's very problematic now. That I think one of the most exhausting things, having worked a little bit, I was chair of the diversity committee for a couple of years at my old institution, and there are a lot of problems with institutional pushes to diversity. It doesn't mean diversity or difference is being addressed or in a meaningful way. It doesn't mean that inclusion is actually happening, right? But one of the most exhausting things was trying to convince people that this mattered at all, to say, okay, listen, like, we should actually want a community that has people from different perspectives and different backgrounds. Like, that will make our academic world, the knowledge we produce, the teaching we enact, our capacity to engage with students, like, we should want all of us to have academic life world itself be like more diverse. And I don't mean just like we need another man because there's an extra woman on this committee. Like, I mean something that's really meaningful. And so, I think that's something that, I don't know, I'm going to be curious to see what happens in Norway in the next few years. As I think this is going to be a fight. The academy, higher education, whatever we want to call it, is now I don't want to use the term battleground, but it's a site of struggle. So I'm going to be curious to see how this happens. I also think, generations change, and, deals with migration right at the heart of things, like, as populations become more diverse linguistically, religiously, like, all of those things, like, things do change. But the US, we know, is a deeply diverse society, right? It's built on a history of genocide and slavery. And yet we lack people from oppressed backgrounds, oppressed minorities in the academy. So I do know that very, very concerted efforts have to be made in order to make higher education and knowledge more diverse. And I'm going to use and celebrate that term. And I think having arguments about whether we can use race as a concept, I think those kinds of things are going to get in the way. Like, and I think in anthropology, it will be important to, like, have a consensus that certain concepts matter. The role of language, I know it's a deeply politicized term, issue in Norway, is sort of recognizing that people who come from different backgrounds do bring something to the table that's important. And, as the American who's recently moved to Norway, I know that's probably not the best. I'm probably not the best person to be saying those things, but I do think that's something that I can see myself struggling with, like, wanting to teach around these issues, not knowing whether it's okay to do so, what kinds of language is okay. And I'll be learning about the context as I go along. But I think that Norway should Norwegian higher education should get on board with some of those concepts that are now being rejected wholesale in the US. And one final point, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, but the one thing I just wanted to say, I was imagining, oh, how cool would it be to actually engage with media? Media. I don't mean to be so cynical. I mean, I talk to government people or people who work in judges, that kind of thing. And I know a lot of them are really wanting to do good work. But I do think a lot of the time people know exactly what is going on and they don't care. Like, I think some of what we do in education is going to be, I'm not the first person to say this, of course, it's not going to be about like informing people. It's also going to be about convincing them morally. And I think also to pick up on something that both Katrina and Heidi talked about in terms of voices and humanization, like that's a place that anthropology has a lot of power, right? Like the human cost. And that's where I struggle, right? I have trouble with the fact that all of the suffering of Palestine is focused around children, but I know why we have to focus on that. I know why it's important to care about women. I mean, we have to use images of mothers and children and families who are dying in border crossings, not like all the young men who are dying. But I really want a situation where we also care about the young Muslim men who are dying, right, on borders. So I think that's sometimes really hard, the way that the voice becomes, I have a really hard time not critiquing like the sort of stereotyped narratives and voices that sort of drive a lot of the power like of narrative, right, that we do as anthropologists. So right now I know I'm going a little bit in a critical cave, but that's hard to do. That's hard to do, and it's hard to deal with, and I don't really know how to deal with it actually, but I thought I'd mark it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, Katrina, you wanted to speak to this.
Yes, I do agree how important it is to have engaged anthropology and education that aims to deepen the understanding across lines of difference. And I think that's one of the beauties of our discipline. But then also see how, post 7th of October in Norway, I've been working in the Middle East for 10 years, and in Israel for 2 years, I did my doctorate on nation building practices in Israel. And I think I also done a project on Norwegian Jewish identity. And I think post 7th of October, there has been a lot of public empathy and understanding of Jewish identity and traumas and lived experience. And I think it's really important to also understand how this conflict has also contributed to not only polarization, but a deepening of lived experienced alienation amongst a tiny Jewish minority, which is 1,500 people, because it was a very delayed public response from the Prime Minister and public officials after the massacres on 7th of October, where nearly 1,200 people were killed. And that space of delay in policy response was quite re-traumatizing in terms of intergenerational trauma. So I think, it's important to both have academics that can identify and understand rising levels of anti-Semitism, how you define it and the boundaries, and also acknowledge and honoring the dignity of all victims. So I think that's, the benefit and also sometimes the disadvantage in Norway, where we say we can all be public engaged, is that sometimes the most vocal or the most, the larger communities get more knowledge, and also hence the analysis get more informed. So I think it's so important to be able to have public knowledge and empathy also of how transnational critical events and conflicts both inform the threat level. If you look at the now security, the police security services in Norway and emerging trends in the threat landscapes is really about also increased level of hatred towards Jews and Israeli institutions. And we also see that in Europe. And of course, there are then measures being implemented, but to also acknowledge the impact on lived experience. And I think these are difficult debates, and I know this context is different in the US, but I was in Pittsburgh actually before the presidential election, and I spoke with colleagues there and about how, after the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, how different faiths and lifestyles communities came together in order to so-called eradicate hate, but also looking at an understanding and deepening understanding across communities, but also based on an intersectional understanding of dehumanization and racism. So my point is about, it's great to be both an anthropologist and activist for human rights and against political violence, but also to not allow blind zones to emerge that will also have actually real human consequences in Norway. So it's to do both. I've seen the latter has been a bit unfortunately lacking in Norway.
Thank you, Katrine. Heidi, did you want to?
Yeah, just a few things. I guess I want to start by saying I'm really happy that you brought that point out about colorblindness in Norway. Heath, I think you're very placed as a near-liminal position to see that. But yeah, but it's that because I feel like so far in the conversation we have maybe tended to exceptionalize Norway a bit, and that's definitely one of the many problems with the Norwegian public education and discourse is this supposed color blindness and reluctance to talk about race and racism and colonialism and many other things. That's discourse of innocence that's very pervasive in Norwegian politics and unfortunately also reproduced by many Norwegian scholars. So you definitely should continue bringing in those critical concept to your classroom and conversation with Norwegian anywhere. I think. Yeah, I think the other thing I just want to add, which maybe speaks to what both Heath and Catherine said, was that, and I definitely don't think you disagree with this, and it may be to just point out the obvious, but I think it's important when you speak about public anthropology that we have to do more than, we're not activists or journalists. We have to bring in our anthropological knowledge somehow, whether that is to refer to lived experience and ethnography or using our, critical, theoretical and analytical tools to challenge state narratives or public discourses and concepts and so on. So I think that's something that's very important and part of sometimes my frustration writing in newspaper when kind of that part is what get edited out or when although there are many situations I have no problem stating a political normative position, but ideally I think that's less interesting what I believe than what I could bring to the table in terms of political critical analysis. And then of course it's possible to read in some of my or interpret some politics based on what I'm arguing, but I think we always have to make sure that we bring something more to the table than just stating our political position. And I think what you mentioned, Catherine, about the delayed response from the Prime Minister is very true. At the same time, as I think it also was true that many people in the Palestinian community felt disregarded when the Prime Minister and every other politician started every sentence by saying, I condemn the attack 17th of October. And that's something that for example, I and also others pointed out in our intervention that by always beginning the sentence by that, you are, first of all, dehistoricizing the event, but also kind of highlighting the primacy of value of Jewish life. So I think this is the kind of arguments that's useful to bring up as scholars, because it comes with a clear analysis and not just, it's not just an activist position or journalistic rendering of the events, but it brings in a critical analysis.
So we're slowly moving towards the end of this panel, in the middle of this engaged discussion, and there is so much that we could talk about, but I wanted to steer us towards a question that we have already, that you have all of you spoken about, regarding how these challenges that we've been trying to map out now, how they can be met now. in doing engaged anthropology. So I wanted to invite you to reflect a little bit more on that. And maybe we could start by Heath. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about this task force in academic freedom that the Association of Political and Legal Anthropology has recently started. Is that one of the ways in which we can meet these challenges?
I don't know about that, but I can tell you a little bit more about it. No, so I'm president of Association for Political and Legal Anthropology, and we publish the main thing that we've done historically is publish the journal Polar, Political and Legal Anthropology Review. Great journal. Submit to Polar now if you want to, and really just the American Anthropological Association meetings. I mean, it's a section of the American Anthropological Association, and I say that because I think in the past these kinds of professional organizations have had a very sort of clear and non-politicized in some way purview in terms of the kinds of work that we were supposed to do, but also could do, right? We have a pretty small budget. And a lot of it's very sort of what we do is like been quite internal to anthropology, for better and worse. Or even American anthropology. I think that's changed over time. I think there's been a lot of shifts towards like bringing the political into political and legal anthropology. And I think we have a very sort of I think we have a board and a membership now that is, first of all, much more transnational. For instance, Hayala Karzu, who's now going to be the incoming president of EASA, is also on APLA's board. So we have a lot of nice sort of collaborative possibilities institutionally. But I think also what we must do has shifted, and so I think we're doing a conference and a journal is really not it's not enough for any academic professional organization anymore. So I think what we did, we had a business meeting, and a lot of people were just there's a lot of need for support. Internationally, certainly in the US, but also knowledge sharing about things like rights, like what should you do if you're getting targeted by a student or somebody brings a complaint to you about your syllabus. I mean, these kinds of things are going to be happening again and again and again. And so we came up with this task force. It's one of these great examples about anthropology sort of like borrows government language. It's a task force. I used the term and then it just stuck, a task force. And we've got working groups, and one of the major things we're trying to do, we're trying to compile and disseminate knowledge about sort of best practices or possibly not best practices. We're also interested in best practices, but how to support people who are at various contexts, various stages in their career, various institutions. So that's the first thing. So sort of an information repository. We're still collecting it and trying to figure out the best way to disseminate. The second thing is to try to build some kind of peer mentoring network, which is also very challenging in this because a lot of the advice that people need is very specific to their institution. It's very specific to the state or country, obviously, they're in. But talking about the US, the state you're in, the legislation is different. You can't just get someone to give legal advice unless they're actually like being contracted as a lawyer. There are a lot of issues at stake that, you start, it's the kind of thing that sounds really great, but it's actually going to be very complicated to to produce usable things for people in the time when they need them. We're trying to document accounts of people who have been targeted. A lot of this was inspired by Mara Finkelstein, the professor at Muhlenberg College in the US, who did lose her job for her activism on social media around Palestine. But it's a much more wide-ranging set of issues. So I guess just going back to the temporality, it's also about expectations. What can we do? how usable is it going to be? I very much hope that we're going to be able to produce useful material for people. But again, this issue of time, when it's needed, it takes time to do a good job with things, and also energy, right? Everyone's so tapped out, so when everyone's so tired, finding that energy to make things happen is hard. And I think that's another thing about engaged anthropology. Just doing the basics, just doing the teaching, writing that article, that's a lot. So sort of doing this other kind of institutional work is really hard, or challenging in a lot of ways. So thank you. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you. Katrina, you already gave us one example of how you had been working sort of to meet the challenges in the extremism committee. But what do you think? What are the sort of most important things we can do, both individually and collectively?
Well, collectively, I think it's extraordinarily important that we do have infrastructure of support at universities, because you do disseminate knowledge voluntarily, but it can impact your security, your well-being, and so forth. It can have a price, so that you have procedures and infrastructure, training and support at institutions. And I think also, the discipline, we have a long tradition of speaking about critical issues. And in some countries, we see how academia is under threat. In other countries, we can still speak quite freely. And then we do have this ethical, as I said, this ethical responsibility to share our results. But do we do it all the time? No, we don't do it all the time. It's a resource, it's resources, it's time consuming and so forth. But when we do it, we should do it quite rigorously, and we should have a peer-reviewed article in mind, even if we do live commenting almost on a phenomenon in the news cycle. And we should also have, reflect continuously on the ethical complexities and the consequences of the dissemination that we do. And I think towards the end, I think we are in a very privileged position to be able to both bring our knowledge to the public square and also collectively show that we are also often disagreeing. I mean, institutions like, the university is the place for learning how to disagree, the place for critical thinking, which is also the medicine for the spread of disinformation and contempt for knowledge. So I think if we can manage to bring our discussions out there in the public square, it's worthwhile the time. And I think it's also an important moment in time to do so.
Yes, thank you, Katrina. I think that's very important also to discuss and figure out how we can also bring our disagreements out in to these public discussions and the public engagement that we have. Heidi, do you have something you wanted to add to how do we face the challenges that we have been discussing?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have so much to add to what has already been said. I want to say, I didn't say this in the beginning, but I'm really honored to be invited with these amazing scholars who I, have looked up to for a really long time. And so, yeah, it's been really a pleasure to discuss with you guys. And I think that also, says something about what I really value about the academic environment in Norway is that it's still quite egalitarian and you can, I think that's also something we and with respect for differences, though I think many people think it's too conformist, and maybe that's true as well, but it's the egalitarian part of the academic environment in Norway is something coming from the UK, which I learned to cherish deeply, and also something that we really have to protect. So I can just say a little bit about EASA. Both EASA and the World Anthropological Union are the two institutions that I've been somewhat involved with, and they have both established also a task force. They also use that word for human rights and academic freedom. And maybe I should also add, because it's nice to recognize that when I was in Johannesburg in November for the World Anthropological Union, and they did, or we presented this motion about establishing this task force or commission. Thomas Hylland Eriksen was also honored there as an honorary member, which also, I mean, it's not a surprise. He's received so many honors, but every time Thomas Hylland Eriksen get honors, I feel it is a little bit like it's a victory for public anthropology, because as much as he was also a great theorist and intellectual, he was, at least to me, always also a public anthropologist. So it's a good sign that that he was honored as an honorary member also in the World Anthropological Union. So it would be interesting to continue to follow the work of those two institutions, which is barely started. I think the commission for the WOW haven't started yet. And I think it's something that we in Norway should follow closely. I also just want to reiterate the point about seeing academic precarity and repression together. And like it was mentioned here about infrastructure and mentorship and also caring for each other. Cecilia Salinas at the University of Oslo, I remember I talked to her about her work on decolonization, because I'm a coordinator on the decolonizing group at CMI, and she really said something that I will always remember, was that I'm going to paraphrase here, but she said something about how we really can't just only address decolonization without acknowledging that we have to start basically by caring also of each other inside our academic communities. And I think that's something that's so easy to forget, and that also links with what Catherine and Heath said. So to create an environment that we might have this uncomfortable discussion about decolonization, that we might foster more public engagement, we also have to have a inclusive working environment where we take care of each other, and we recognize, I think many of my colleagues, both in Norway and elsewhere, are going through a really hard time at the moment because of what's happening in the US, in the Middle East, in Sudan. I mean, many of my colleagues work in Sudan, and it's hard to go to work and kind of pretend that everything is normal and continue with your daily task of publishing and writing and teaching and so on. And I think that idea that we should continue as everything is normal kind of presuppose this idea that you can separate the personal life from the scholarly life. And I think that for most of us, that's impossible. So to kind of acknowledge that and to be there for each other, I think that's very important.
Thank you, all of you, for these great suggestions. And the Norwegian Anthropological Association will be following closely the work of these task forces in the future. And I hope that we can also contribute to creating these kinds of meeting places and contexts where we can debate important issues for discipline and challenges related not least to being engaged anthropologists in these turbulent times. So thanks so much to all of you, Catherine, Heath, and Heidi.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.